Dr. John Kaye.
Thank you, Madam Deputy President. Madam Deputy President, I rise to speak on the two planning bills, the Planning Bill 2013 and the Planning Administration Bill 2013, the cognates. And in doing so, I seek to associate myself with the remarks of Mr David Shoebridge and Dr Marin Faruqi, whose excellent presentations covered the bases. I just want to add my voice to the opposition to these bills, and I do so from a perspective of somebody who spent some time before they were in this chamber working in local community action against inappropriate development. So I don't have a view that comes necessarily from a detailed knowledge of planning from a planner's perspective, but I do have experience from the perspective of somebody who has worked with communities to stop developers coming in and stealing public space, appropriating the values of the community and walking away with massive profits. This legislation before the House today represents a once-in-a-generation opportunity. There'll be another 30 years before we get to rewrite the planning bills, and I suspect most of us, with the possible exception of the Honourable Steve Wan, will have moved on to other pastures or other existences, or no existence at all by then. So this is it. This is the once an opportunity to address the divisive, biased and unworkable provisions within the existing Environmental Planning and Assessment Act 1979. And in saying that, I acknowledge that the Act, when it was first written, was world-leading and took New South Wales to a better place than it had been in before. But the bill was, the original Act, the 1979 Act, was fiddled with by governments, inserting provisions purchased by massive above-the-table donations from developers and possibly a few that went under the table. And the divisive, biased and unworkable provisions of that legislation have come to a crisis point, such that the O'Farrell government went to the last election with a promise to bring forward something new. And yet that promise has been comprehensively violated by this legislation, because so much of what was detested in the final versions of the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act, Part 3A, private certifiers, neighbourhoods being overruled by developers, the myth that communities need to be destroyed in order to create affordable development, the high-speed development, all of those have been reproduced into these new bills. They've been reproduced, and in some cases they have been amplified in these bills. We will continue to see local communities powerless in the face of a developer onslaught. Neighbourhood values will continue to be devastated by development that is out of character and out of place. The attack on the natural environment will continue and be accelerated, where weak and developer bias controls will fail to protect ecological communities, habitats and wild places. There will be continued corruption pressure on ministers, on planning, on the Department of Planning, on planners and on local councils. In short, these bills solve none of the problems of the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act, and in some instances they create new ones. This is an important issue. This is more than just one other law. Planning laws sit at the heart of a society. Bad planning laws produce not just bad planning outcomes, they produce bad social outcomes, bad political outcomes and bad economic outcomes. The built environment is where we live, it's where we work, it's where we play, it's where we reflect, it's where we grow up, it's where we die. The built environment is our home, it is our heart, it is us. The built environment determines the quality of life that we live. It determines the outcomes. It determines the outcomes not just for individuals and households, but it determines the outcomes for communities. Bad planning outcomes alienate and destroy communities. Individual health and the quality of life is at stake. Community health, the capacity for communities to get together, to be communities, to share ideas, to share aspirations, to share friendship, to share those things that communities do, can be killed off by bad planning. And these bills represent bad planning. These bills will produce the continued deterioration of the built environment. This state has been ripped apart by corruption pressure, and in no small measure by corruption pressure from developers. These bills continue to create the corruption pressure that was seen under the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act, and in some cases exacerbate it. We know that the changes to the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act were bought by tens of millions of dollars of above-the-counter donations from developers to political parties. How much below the counter donations will never be known. But what we do know is that there were individuals and there were councils whose decisions were bought off by the previous Act, and these bills that come before the House today will leave this state continuously vulnerable to corruption pressures around planning. Good planning produces powerful communities. Poor planning produces powerless communities. These bills will disempower not just households but entire communities. That will not just have bad outcomes for planning, it has bad outcomes for community development. Bad planning destroys a natural environment. When I first moved to Sydney, there were Christmas beetles. Every Christmas, even when you lived in the eastern suburbs, the Christmas beetles would come. Some as large as 2 or 3 centimetres across would come in, and they would be, and the gorgeous creatures that they are, they have disappeared entirely. It has been 3 or 4 years, since we've seen Christmas, and the science tells us the reason is that science tells us that the habitat of Christmas beetles, the habitat trees of Christmas beetles in the Cumberland Plains have been entirely removed, and the Christmas beetles of the Cumberland Plain have disappeared. But it's much worse than that. We constantly see endangered ecological communities destroyed, swallowed up into inappropriate developments. We see species like koalas driven to the brink of extinction by development into their habitat. And good planning laws, and these planning laws will do nothing to protect with the state significant development categories. These planning laws will continue that attack on the natural environment. And I note here the contribution about referring to ecological sustainable development from my colleague, Dr. Marin Faruqi, and I recommend to those people who didn't hear that they get her book and they read it. It's a life changer. It's a life changer of a book, and I believe it's in the library for people who are too mean to purchase it. Madam Deputy President, the fifth aspect of good planning is the protection of natural and built environment heritage. Built environment heritage is not just about living in a museum. It's not just about protecting one example of this design and one example of that design. Good heritage is about a home for the community that connects its past to its present, and connects its present to its future. Without that connection, severing that connection, we sever our connection to who we are and how we became who we are. Good heritage is not just charming. Good heritage is about healthy communities. Good heritage is about living our lives in a way that acknowledges who we are and how we got here. Madam Deputy President, from the built environment to corruption to power in the community to the natural environment to heritage, these planning laws reproduce all of the failures of the previous planning laws and create some of their own. It's always been argued that we need to have planning laws that favour developers in order to get affordable housing. We need to give developers the power to ride roughshod over communities in order to make sure that we get housing that people can afford to live in. It's been used as an excuse time and time again, not just to change the planning laws, but also to ram through developments that were inappropriate. But the reality is something completely opposite. It is a complete myth to suggest that the free market will create affordable housing. The free markets will see and have seen public spaces and public amenity privatised and converted into big profits of the big developers, while housing and apartment prices continue to rise and pass through the thresholds of affordability for more and more members of our community. The market in development does not produce affordability because developers will always focus on high-end development where they can make the maximum profit, and they will not want to produce affordable outcomes because that is where there is the least amount of profit. This ideology This ideology of free markets in planning has failed and failed comprehensively. Have a look at the simultaneous homelessness and vacancy rates. Have a look at the simultaneous housing stress and soaring profits for the developers and for landlords. Have a look at the simultaneous urban sprawl that goes on in Sydney and at the same time inner city residential neighbourhoods struggling to resist the onslaught of high-rise developers. Housing affordability is not beyond our reach, but it cannot be gained by giving the developers free rein. Housing affordability can be gained by public investment in public housing. Housing affordability can be gained by planning that exerts control over developers and forces them to, instead of just collecting massive amounts of rent on rezoning, to put some of that money back into affordable housing. Once we constrain developers, once we put public investment, public money back into public housing, we create affordability. But the market will create unaffordability, as indeed it has done. This bill talks about planning for infrastructure, yet it fails to separate out infrastructure and housing. If this government was serious about planning for infrastructure, serious about planning, it would make sure that it was not just water and transport and electricity that were provided to new developments, but also schools, health services such as hospitals, aged care services and open space. But this bill does none of these. I want to, in my remaining time, concentrate on three aspects of this legislation, which I believe are some of the most egregious failures of this government to fulfil its promise to restore power to communities. And the first and personally most annoying to me is the continuation of private certifiers, and not just their continuation, Madam Deputy President, but giving them a broader scope of action. There is no question that private certification in New South Wales has created massive perverse incentives. Earning a reputation for being a lenient private certifier is the sure path to making a lot of money and being successful and being very popular with developers. Those private certifiers that have tried to do the right thing and been rigorous in their application of planning laws and planning instruments inevitably lose out to those who are slack and who build up a reputation for being friendly to developers and friendly to development. Private certification has created a dynamic in this industry that is veritably designed to make a mockery of the planning instruments. In 1998, Labor introduced what became one of the biggest gifts to their developer mates, and these bills expand that role. Instead, what these bills could have done was to look for alternative ways of certification. The obvious solution would have been a qualified pool with random selection from that pool, so as that there is no advantage, no commercial advantage to the private certifier in developing a reputation for being lenient towards development. That would have removed the perverse incentive by removing the selectivity that developers can exert over which private certifier they use, and hence the pressure that they put onto private certifiers to be lenient towards their developments. Or even better still, returning the bulk of the certification work back to public sector officials in local councils where they did an excellent job. Labor's transformation of what was a public sector activity into a marketplace was a gift for developers that the O'Farrell government should not continue to give. The second aspect of this legislation that is a particular or egregious failure is the focus on speed of development approval at the expense of democracy, the environment and the rights to protect neighbourhood character. Nowhere is this more clear than in code-accessible development. 25 days code-accessible development under this legislation has to be approved within 25 days. It can only be achieved within 25 days by the ticker box approach. No right for submission, no right for proper assessment, no right for merit-based assessment, just a bunch of private certifiers who are in there to prove how pro-development they are, ticking boxes off a checklist that will do nothing to protect the local community. And Madam Deputy President, this isn't just for a shed in the back garden, this is for up to 20 townhouses in a residential neighbourhood or a residential flat building in your local shopping centre, your local shopping neighbourhood precinct. Madam Deputy President, This is the very opposite of re-empowering local communities. This is the very, very opposite of what the O'Farrell government promised. This is developers. This is developers who are having their paths greased for them by laws that make it extremely easy. Madam Deputy President, I make the observation that development is here forever. Pre-existing use rights means that in perpetuity, the bulk, scale and form of any approval will be there for our children, our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren. Planning is a one-way trip to greater density. It has to be gotten right. The Telegraph, that mouthpiece for the development lobby, regularly attacks councils over the time they take. But the reality is that councils should take time. They should take time to make sure that the outcomes are high quality. The outcomes work not just now, but will work in perpetuity. They should make sure that the outcomes are quality for today, for tomorrow and forever. This new bill is a high-speed tick-off approach where there is no notification for neighbours. You can wake up one morning and the bulldozers can be in next door for a code-compliant, a code-assessed development that you weren't notified of, that suddenly is being built. It could be up to 20 townhouses, or if you live near a shopping centre, near your local neighbourhood shopping centre, it could be a residential flat building, and you didn't even have a chance to comment on it. In what way, I invite the Minister to respond, does that fulfil the O'Farrell government's promise to respect local communities, to re-empower local communities? The third part of this the third aspect of this legislation I wish to address is the issue of state significant development. Part 3A is not dead, Madam Deputy President. Part 3A is alive and kicking, and it's coming to kick you real soon in the community. This is the virus that we have not been able to kill off, the virus that corrupts the process, the virus that undermines local environment constraints, that undermines native vegetation and heritage protections, the virus that uses pious arguments about economic development to strip communities of their power to protect their neighbourhoods, to strip the environment of its ecological diversity in order to grease the path for developers. I can't begin to number the inappropriate Part 3A developments that have been pushed through, but I wish to refer to the Coogee Bay Hotel, which was pushed through, the redevelopment of the Coogee Bay Hotel that was pushed through. And it always fascinated me that the local then Labor Member of Parliament, Paul Pearce, a good guy, a former mayor of Waverley, stood there at a meeting that David Shoebridge and I convened in the lead-up to the 2011 election and decried the problems of Part 3A and the pressure it was putting on redevelopment at Coogee Bay. The Liberal candidate, now a member, Bruce Notley-Smith, same statement. How bad is Part 3A? The voters in Coogee had the extraordinary proposition that every candidate for Coogee said how bad Part 3A is, yet now they have elected a parliament, and that parliament is going to reproduce Part 3A in its new form. And now Part 4A or Part 5A, it does not matter what number this parliament and this government gives it, it is still Part 3A, it is still the virus that eats away at the very heart of good democracy and of good planning. The Minister says state significant development will not be applied to residential or retail development. But it's not in the Act, it's not in the bills. Nowhere in the bills is there an injunction against state significant development the state significant development provisions being applied to the residential or retail development sector. And how long will it be until a planning minister, under pressure from a Triggerboff or a Lowry or a Wal King, reopens the floodgates to residential development being done by Part 3A? There is no question that the emblematic promise of the O'Farrell government to re-empower communities has been violated by this legislation. But when we go to the next election, the real debate will be who was it who stood up against Part 3A? Labor's Part 3A reproduced by the coalition as Part 4A. To break this virus, we need politicians with courage who stand up and say it is time genuinely not just to talk about re-empowering communities, but to re-empower communities. This legislation fails to do so, this legislation should not be allowed to pass this Parliament. The existing legislation is bad, but we can do better.
The member's time has expired.